Hello, and welcome to WOATs, where we look at the worst media of all time. This is a show about failures, and today we're showcasing one of my favorite kinds of failures, when big studios lose big money. It's one thing to have a bomb, but when it comes with a movie that's heavily pushed by the studios, it makes the failure even funnier. Especially when the audience for those movies are...
Is this Canada?
Yeah, I don't know. Think of movies like Cats, Jupiter Ascending, Super Mario Bros. And in today's case, Xanadu. Ooh, look how lame that cover is. Now, what is Xanadu exactly? Well, step into a magical world with superstars Olivia Newton-John and Gene Kelly as they take you through one of the most extraordinary musicals in the beloved film Xanadu. A beautiful muse is sent from up above to inspire a struggling artist and help motivate him to open a roller disco. The dazzling soundtrack includes the hit songs Magic, I'm Alive, All Over the World, Suddenly, and the title song, Xanadu. Throw on your roller skates, turn up the volume, and enjoy this sparkling, out-of-this-world fantasy. Now, this sounds really corny and terrible, right? Well, it is. But there's one thing mentioned here that's undeniably true. Xanadu does have a good soundtrack with some legitimate hit songs on it. Magic is the third highest charting single of that year. The soundtrack went double platinum and had the help of Electric Light Orchestra, but was attached to one of Universal's biggest bombs up to that point.
Xanadu, with songs by ELO, a musical fantasy, rated PG.
Now, how can a glitzy and sweeping, vast ELO-backed disco record sell so well and yet be attached to a movie that bombed so hard? Well, for one, this movie's not from the 1970s. It's from the 80s. Well, kinda. It's 1980. The 80s we know haven't really started yet. MTV's a year away from launching, Jimmy Carter's still in office, and most of the hottest songs sound less like New Wave and more like Air Supply, Rupert Holmes, and the Captain and Tennille. Despite a riot of angry rock music fans destroying disco records the summer prior, the dying genre still manages to hiccup a few final hits. Film-wise, sequels to 70s flicks and movie adaptations of its shows were the highest grossing, but there are notable failures that will change the trajectory of the industry. One was Michael Cimino's new Hollywood-era killing Heaven's Gate, and the other was Xanadu.
Xanadu.
You probably haven't heard of Xanadu, probably because you're not a trillion years old, but it was a pretty big punching bag at the time. It inspired the Razzies, the anti-Oscars, that very same year. Now, most people have left this cigarette butt in the ashtray between Off the Wall and Thriller, but it does have a cult following. Am I part of it? Hell no. But I will admit, this movie does do some things right. It just does way more wrong. Xanadu was conceptualized as a crappy, low-budget roller disco movie in the late 70s that Universal snowballed into an intended blockbuster with bigger names and a bigger budgets. The end product was meant to be a lavish musical nostalgic for the Hollywood Golden Age's big sets and choreography, with a then modern approach of rock and pop music. The soundtrack's production coincided with the film's. One side, songs for Olivia Newton-John by her producer John Farrer, and side 2, songs by Electric Light Orchestra, produced by the man, the myth, the legend, Jeff Lynne. ELO is of course one of the best-selling bands of all time, and one whose catalog is still some of the best sounding from their era. They were ambitious and, to their name, orchestral, with these big, luscious-sounding pop singles. Bandleader Jeff Lynne, besides being the head songwriter and singer and multi-instrumentalist, also served as their producer and has such an amazing grasp at making great sounding music. But you probably know them as the band that made the Baby Groot song. And then you got the late Olivia Newton-John, who, going into the 80s, was one of the biggest stars in the world. She had hit after hit during a good chunk of the 70s, and seemed to peak with 1978's Grease, a retro-themed musical she co-led with another of the era's superstars, John Travolta. Xanadu's soundtrack was released 2 years later and before the film, in June 1980, and sold over 5 million copies worldwide. Universal expected the film to be one of the biggest hits of the year. And I mean, with Newton-John's track record and an already hit album, Xanadu was a shoo-in for a summer blockbuster come August, right?
So at the moment, you've got the number one hit in England with Xanadu, and in Europe, a number one hit with Xanadu. In America, you're the number one hit with Magic. And in Australia, you've got Magic going up the charts and Don't Cry For Me Argentina, which is also going into the charts.
It's really tough at the moment.
Yes, it must be.
Well, it wasn't. It lost millions. For Newton-John, it was a stumble. She would be fine. But others wouldn't fare so well. Co-leading the film is Michael Beck, who you know as Swan from the Warriors and... Swan from the Warriors video game.
You don't want to get up, buddy.
After Xanadu's failure, he never acted in another major studio movie again, but was it really his fault?
Last one in, first one home. You know I wouldn't come back to all this unless I had to. I spend my whole life painting what other people want. I paint his van, I paint somebody else's mural, I paint Simpsons album covers. Then, when I finally quit to freelance, not only do I almost starve to death, but I can't figure out what I want to do.
Okay, yeah, it was, but the script was also to blame, and everyone knew it.
During the filming, I think a half a dozen or so writers were hired and fired. So the script was constantly changing. Xanadu was the biggest financial loss for a movie that Universal had suffered.
Despite having rewrite after rewrite, they had little to show for it when shooting day arrived.
Went to Universal and Larry said, good news, bad news. Good news is I think we're going to make this movie. Bad news is you're being rewritten.
I remember very clearly getting this script. It was like 45 pages. It was very weak, to be polite about it.
Universal called me back and threw the thing at me and said, we want you to rewrite it. So now I have an original script, I'm rewritten, I have another script and I'm rewritten. He did it one more time, maybe two more times.
Well, lo and behold, the script never got fixed. Became longer than 45 pages, but it never got fixed, even though there were many writers working on it.
We'll get to its many, many tonal inconsistencies later, but the dialogue is genuinely terrible, sounding like a parody of a generic bad movie.
You paint beautifully.
This is the first time I've cared about what I painted in a long time.
That's a shame. It must be frustrating to waste your talents on things that don't really matter to you.
Yeah.
Now, Xanadu's story is dated and weird, but doable in the right hands. Michael Beck plays a failing artist in LA, painting advertisements for music companies. One day while moping around, he's kissed by a roller skating Greek muse, played by Olivia Newton-John, and wanders all over West Side looking for her. He eventually does, but he also crosses paths with a legitimate film legend who convinces him to help build a new, retro nightclub. That legend? Gene Kelly.
Hope you don't mind a little noontime music, kid. A little lunchtime serenade?
Oh, I don't mind.
Gene Kelly was one of the most iconic movie stars of all time. During Hollywood's golden age, he could do no wrong. He dangled from the street light in Singin' in the Rain. He waltzed through the fountain in An American in Paris. He danced with iconic cartoon star Stewie Griffin. And he is electric throughout all of it. He was a master of his craft and could just dance like no one else. His agility and strength showed him pull off entire energetic segments effortlessly. How the fuck is he not even breaking a sweat? But when he needed to, he could be as graceful as a stare, and his suave smile just made him the perfect Tinseltown idol. He was an extremely talented man, and he knew it. He was notoriously pompous. Look at his face, there's not a single ounce of humbleness. He was infamously mean to young Debbie Reynolds, who was a rising star in Singin' in the Rain. Good Morning took 15 hours to film and left her with bleeding feet, and Kelly never once gave her any words of encouragement or coaching, and vocally spoke about not wanting to star beside her, simply because she was inexperienced compared to him.
So say good morning!
Good morning!
But let's be real, it's her second film. She's only 19, and she's still keeping up with Kelly and Donald O'Connor, another amazing dancer from the time.
But that backflip though.
So yeah, he's just an arrogant, old-school Hollywood asshole, but he was famous during the 40s and 50s. Once the big, glamorous musical trend died out, he really didn't have anything going for him and started taking more jobs directing rather than starring. Fun fact, he was approached by screenwriter Ernest Lehman to direct The Sound of Music, but kicked him out of his house and said the movie was, and I quote, a piece of shit.
The Sound of Music, Robert Weiss.
Stupid. By the time Xanadu came out in 1980, he'd barely acted in years, and he only took the job after Kenny Ortega kissed his ass.
You need to come down to the studio. You're meeting Gene Kelly. He's not going to dance in the movie, but he won't do the movie if he doesn't like you. And I was like, what? And Gene says to me, I'm not dancing in the film. And he goes, but if I was going to dance in the film, what would you have me do? And I wasn't prepared for that. However, I was a huge fan of Gene Kelly. And I said, well, I'd probably just go to your own vocabulary. I'd go right to, you know, what it is that you made great. And he said, like what? And I remembered some of the steps from some of the films, and I started doing them. And as I started doing them, he started naming them. About a half an hour later, he stopped, shook my hand, opened up the door, walked out, and looked at Joel and Larry, who almost fell through the door, and said, I'll do the picture.
First and foremost, this movie is a musical, and thankfully, there's very little downtime between songs, so that means you don't have to watch Michael Beck argue with his coworkers with a script out of the Brady Bunch too often.
Michelangelo, glad you're here. The ceiling needs painting.
Uh-huh. All right, that's enough.
Well, the great Sonny Malone returns to Airflow Records, welcomed by cheering throngs of thousands. Art world fails to suffer. News at 11.
Cut it out.
Now, don't forget, this movie is, and I quote, a piece of shit, but I did say that it does do some things right. The first song, I'm Alive, is a disgustingly 70s laser show with big puffy hair, but I don't think it's that bad. Taking it out of context of the movie, it's weird, but it could work on its own. There's some genuinely terrible effects when the muses run around LA, but you'd forgive it if it were in a 1980 music video. But this isn't a 1980 music video. This is a wannabe blockbuster made by Universal. And this is really the only song that could have this identification separate from the movie. Magic, the soundtrack's biggest hit, could also be a decent video, but we need more work. Have some more mystical looking cinematography and take out the dialogue, and it could be something kind of soft and majestic. Olivia Newton-John roller skating gracefully through soft glimmering pink light shining through the windows of a big, beautiful Art Deco amphitheater. And yes, Disney adults, your eyes don't deceive you, but those entrances are inspired by this building, the Pan Pacific Auditorium, from the 30s and standing in the Fairfax district. But remember, no matter how gorgeous and historical you are, unless you're the Chinese Theater or the Bradbury Building, you're probably going to get forgotten by the city. It closed in the early 70s, and by Xanadu had fallen into complete disarray.
This place? They used to have wrestling here.
So it's got a history of success. I'd need some fixing up. I think it could look terrific.
So could the Titanic. Kid, you don't need a builder. You need a demolition team.
In the film, it's the to-be home of the titular nightclub, and before you get excited about visiting, don't, because it's deader than Gene Kelly. But it would also be the most jarring, worthlessly niche hangout in the city. They envision it as this collision between 40s big band and disgusting 1980 hard rock, too lame for even a Styx fan. Featuring the famous artsy punk band The Tubes, by the way. This combining of styles is, besides the script, Xanadu's biggest problem. One scene will try being a classy and vintage dance number shot in a big empty room for more chances to glide around, and others will be tightly edited neon puke with lots of hairspray and spandex. Tons of people like old Hollywood musicals, tons of people like cheesy 8-track dad rock, but does anyone want to see them together? There's also a really out-of-nowhere animation segment, which is well made. Yes, it does look like Anastasia, because it's Don Bluth doing it.
I remember sitting in the theater, and as it came up, my heart started to pound. I remember this, and it was pounding really, really hard, and I thought, oh, this is stupid. Why am I getting so excited? This is dumb. But I felt I was going to be laughed at. And then as this thing took off and it started to play, I remember bowing my head. I'd seen it. I thought, oh no, this is terrible. This is terrible. I just know it's terrible.
And it has this golden era Disney feature feel, and it looks great, but comes out of nowhere, and nothing else in the film is like it, so it's just odd. That's the best way to sum up the movie. It's odd, and has a bunch of bad, clashing decisions that appeal to nobody. Why all this tonal inconsistency? Because the lack of a solid script meant that different people were just throwing ideas on, and they just went with all of them.
Larry and Joel and I would have conversations, often yelling. For myself, there was always frustration that we really never had a script and we never solved a script. The effort behind the movie was really to sort of touch the culture with the whole roller skating, which was breaking out at that point.
We hadn't really heard the 40s song, and we didn't really realize how the music kind of fit together, how it all synced up. I had no idea that was going to work like that.
40s group and the 80s group, we didn't mingle too much. They kept us apart. so that when the first day of shooting came in, it was a surprise to a lot of us.
I've got a song that I have not put in this movie, and it has to go in this movie, and I believe it should be done in animation.
And we can't, we're doing a feature. You know, we're too busy, we can't do this. He said, well, yeah, I think you probably can, and here's how much I'm willing to pay you, and I'll pay you some more too, and I'll pay you this, no, whatever, do it. So...
That's why you have a jarring mix of music genres, why there's a random animated segment thrown in, why the only Gene Kelly number looks like one of his classic films.
Gene had already terminated, his contract was over and he didn't want to come back to do it. And finally, he agreed to come back, but only on one condition. He said he would come back so long as it was shot on a closed soundstage, and only Gene, the camera operator, the director of photography, Olivia, and Kenny Ortega would be present, and no one else would be able to participate. There could be no other intrusion.
Him refusing to dance unless they shot the scene under his conditions feels super on brand, by the way. Let's look at the last segment and title track. It's shot on this awesome set, and I mean that. The layout is intricate, the Art Deco pillars with neon rings give it a really distinctive look. But it starts with these people on roller skates chanting Xanadu and doing this wimpy little arm symbol. It's so lame. After a while, you start seeing the tops of the set more and more, and like, this isn't the Broadway melody. Those sets look like stage backdrops purposefully. This is supposed to be this amazing club they've been building up to the whole movie, and we're seeing the studio lights and crew. It reminds me of those in-between SNL bumpers where Lawrence checking the sets. It's also shot less like a glamorously choreographed Gene Kelly sequence, and more like an off-the-cuff live Soul Train dance or something. There was so much energy put into the dancing and theatricality of all of it that falls flat because the cinematography is so bad. Speaking of which, there he is mugging at the camera, you smug prick. I don't even dislike Gene Kelly, his arrogance just radiates through the screen in this flick. Every scene he's in, he's making these goofy ass faces that are fine in an old charming MGM flick, but not in a rock and pop fused confusing mess. It's like if you got Joe Biden as an MLG announcer, like smile all you want, we know you have no interest or clue what any of this shit is. Olivia Newton-John comes out and it's like a music video again, before clumsily transitioning into more jarring genre sequences until it finally ends. It just reeks so hard of trying to appeal to somebody, anybody, and falling flat on its face. So yeah, Xanadu's a bad movie. It has an okay idea that's dragged down by its awful thrown together script. I do mean that. I think there are some great movies then and now that wear its vintage influences on its sleeve and make it fresh and new. But this flick completely fails at it. It's obvious that the people who did care really put a lot into it. Universal threw a ton of money at this bloated piece of shit, and at least its soundtrack sold well. The movie is so confident in itself, even though it is the lamest thing on the planet. No one knows who this movie is for, but I can see why it developed a cult audience who genuinely find some of its segments beautiful. And I'll admit, when the framing isn't atrocious and the set wall cutoffs aren't seen, it can have that lush look it's trying so hard to emulate when its abysmal effects aren't front and center. I didn't even really bring those up, but they speak for themselves. It's just the icing on the cake. 40 years later, and it's still the extremely dated on arrival failure its reputation says it is. Oh well, Xanadu. At least you got a platinum record out of it. But you're still one of the worsts of all time.
Oh, what the hell. Guys like me shouldn't dream anyway.
You're no artist.